What if the real epidemic is not disease, but the quiet moment when your body starts keeping the score before you even know you are losing? Because when 70% of adults are on medication, that is not just a health statistic. That is a civilization whispering that something has gone deeply off. And the most unsettling part is this. The wound is often not a catastrophe. It is the absence of being held, seen, or soothed when it mattered most. So the question is not whether stress is real, but how much of what we call normal is actually unresolved pain in disguise. Let's get into the conversation. 70% of adults on medication is wild. That means distress is basically the background music now. And we just call it normal because it is everywhere. What hit me first was the body saying no before the mind does. Your immune system apparently also gets tired of your personality. That is such a brutal sentence, but it lands. The idea that anger gets shoved down and then leaks out physically is scary. Because people think repression is being nice, not being sick later. Yeah, and the language around it almost rewards the self-abandonment. But hold on. Does every illness really trace back to trauma? I get the pattern, but I also do not want people overclaiming causation. Still, the emotional neglect piece feels uncomfortably plausible. Not being held, not being seen, not being soothed, that stays with you. Kids do not need a disaster to get wounded. They just need absence. That part about the child being left alone after bad news is devastating. Nobody held him, and somehow that sentence is the whole wound. It makes trauma feel less cinematic and way more ordinary, which is exactly why people miss it for decades. The most uncomfortable thing is how familiar his self-doubt sounded. Even the famous trauma doctor is like, I gave a bad talk and spiraled. The brain really says, excellent, let us ruin the whole week. But that was powerful because it showed the theory on himself. The 2-week internet break was basically an intervention from reality. No phone, no email, no ego snacks from the outside world. He kept reaching for the phone like a ghost habit. That compulsion to check for validation is so modern and so ancient at once. Like if nobody is looking, the self starts wobbling. That is the ugly part of success nobody puts on the poster. You get the book deal, the money, the applause, and the emptiness stays. And honestly, that is a very human humiliation. His point about not following his own advice was sharp too. Coaches are always in the middle of their own disaster, apparently. The whole marriage section got really real, really fast. Because he is not talking abstractly, he is talking about what partners actually absorb. When one person turns anxious, the other becomes the emotional container. And then both people start acting like children and calling it love. That is a little too accurate, honestly. The mothering dynamic between men and women was the most provocative part. Some people will hear that and immediately get defensive. But he is not saying women are the problem, he is saying the pattern is. And the pattern is that men often want comfort without vulnerability, which is just emotional freeloading with better vocabulary. Emotional freeloading is nasty, but yeah. The scary part is how easily resentment replaces honesty. Instead of saying, I am anxious, people start performing the anxiety on others. Then they act shocked when the relationship turns to ash. Like, wow, my emotional tax bill arrived. The gut feeling discussion was huge, too. He is basically saying intuition is not mystical fluff, it is biology. The gut, heart, and head as one system is such a clean idea. And if childhood trauma disconnects them, you become all head and no compass. That explains so much bad decision-making in successful people. You can be incredibly smart and still be spiritually unemployed. That is exactly why the rich and famous still implode. Because status can cover the wound, but it cannot heal it. And once the covering drops, the old pain is still right there. I also thought the warning about autoimmune disease was intense. The argument is that chronic self-silencing can turn the body against itself. That is where people will want the scientific line drawn carefully. But the broad mechanism makes sense if stress and immunity are one conversation. It is less magic than management failure. That sounds cold, but the body really is keeping receipts. And the deepest point is probably that healing starts with noticing. Noticing the urge to please, the urge to hide, the urge to disconnect. If you do not notice, you just keep reenacting the same wound. Which is depressing, but also weirdly hopeful. Because if it is a pattern, it can be interrupted. And that is the whole thing, right? Awareness before miracle. Give me a little less miracle, a little more honesty. I do like that he admitted he still struggles with the same stuff. It makes the whole conversation less preachy and more believable. Also, it is comforting when the expert is not a robot. He is basically saying, I know the map and I still get lost. That feels truer than a lot of polished advice. And maybe that is why this lands so hard on people. Because everyone secretly suspects they are carrying old stuff. Old stuff, new suit, same nervous system. Anyway, this one is not leaving my head anytime soon. Same, and we have barely scratched the scary part. Episode 2 gets into what childhood actually does to identity and relationships. And that is where it gets even messier. Bro, the insane part is how normal distress has become. He says 70% of adults are on medication like it is weather. That number just sits there and punches you in the face. And then he ties it straight back to childhood neglect, which is wild. Not dramatic abuse, just not being seen enough. That is the part people hate because it is too ordinary to ignore. We keep wanting trauma to look cinematic, and it is often just absence. No explosions, just emotional starvation. Exactly, and the body keeps the score without asking permission. What got you most, the illness angle or the repression angle? The repression angle, because he is saying niceness can be a symptom. That is such a rude sentence in the best way. Like being overly agreeable can actually be a stress behavior. That is why the body eventually says no for you. Right, and then suddenly it is depression, anxiety, autoimmune stuff, burnout. People act like those are random enemies from nowhere. But he is basically saying they are often a long bill coming due. Yeah, and he is brutal about his own life too. That is what makes him hard to dismiss, honestly. He does not hide behind the doctor voice. The thing where he says he lost himself after the success was huge. That is such a classic trap because success looks like healing from the outside. Meanwhile, inside, you are just busier and more miserable. He literally had the best-selling book, the acclaim, the talks, all of it. And he is like, no, that just made the gap louder. That part about the internet break was fascinating too. A 2-week detox where he kept reaching for the phone like a reflex. We all do that fake reaching thing like the phone is going to hug us back. But his point is the outside validation becomes a substitute for inner steadiness. And once he stopped feeding that loop, he felt different. That felt almost spiritual, not in a preachy way. More like he was finally watching himself instead of being dragged by himself. The psychiatric call after the backlash was such a human moment. Especially because he is supposed to be the guy who already knows. Dr. Heal Thyself is apparently a brutal full-time job. Seriously, though, that admission made him feel more trustworthy. And the whole not being seen thing hit like a truck. Because the media stuff was nasty, but the wound underneath was older. That is the part people miss when they think they are just reacting to today. Today usually just finds the old bruise and presses it. The Prince Harry example was where it got really layered for me. Not because of gossip, but because of how trauma gets carried through privilege. That scene of a child being told his mother died is devastating. Nobody held him, and that is the whole wound right there. He keeps insisting that trauma is also not getting what you needed. That is a much scarier idea than bad events only. Because then you cannot point to one villain and call it solved. Right. It becomes about the emotional environment around the child. And then he goes into touch, grooming, all that mammal stuff. He really said even baby elephants know better than some adults. That line lands because it is so embarrassingly obvious. But it is also a serious claim about brain development and safety. The part about premature babies getting stroked and developing better was intense. It reframes touch as biology, not just affection. And then he connects that to gut feeling, which is where it gets even better. He is saying intuition is not mystical nonsense. It is embodied intelligence. So the brain is not the CEO after all. That is going to annoy a lot of very confident people. He is basically arguing the gut, heart, and head are meant to stay linked. And trauma breaks the wiring between them. Which is why people ignore their own warning signs until they crash. That hit me because he asks audiences about ignoring gut feelings and regretting it later. Almost everyone raises their hand, which is depressing and validating. A terrible group project, but at least we are not alone. Then he moves into relationships, and that is where it gets uncomfortably familiar. The way he describes partners expecting to be mothered is so sharp. It is painful because it sounds ugly and also kind of true. He is not saying love is fake, he is saying unmet childhood need leaks into marriage. And then resentment shows up when the other person does not magically read you. That is such a dangerous fantasy, the whole please save me without me saying anything thing. Emotional telepathy has ruined more relationships than bad Wi-Fi. Bro, that is actually a bar. But he says the real fix is owning the feeling instead of acting it out. That is hard because acting it out is so much easier in the moment. Easy and way more destructive. I think that is why this episode lands so hard. It is not just about trauma, it is about the price of pretending you are fine. And the scary part is how many people call that functioning. Yeah, polished on the outside, fraying everywhere else. We should probably leave it there before we accidentally do a second episode inside this one. Too late, we already did. That was a lot, but it was the kind of lot that sticks. Next one gets even messier when we get into identity and the stories people inherit. Episode 2 is where the family scripts really start leaking everywhere. That line about the body saying no is terrifyingly clean. Because it sounds poetic until you realize it's a warning label. And most of us are reading it like it's optional fine print. The wild part is how normal chronic stress has become. Like being medicated is now the background music of adulthood, which is such a depressing sentence to say out loud. But his point isn't just stress, it's disconnection. Right, not feeling seen, not being held, not being soothed. That's such a child-level wound with adult-level consequences. And people hate that because it removes the easy villain. It's not always one huge catastrophe, it's neglect. That is somehow harder to admit than chaos. Because chaos at least feels dramatic enough to count. Neglect is just the silent kind of damage. And then the kid grows up thinking need is weakness. Which is a fantastic recipe for problems, obviously. The part I keep coming back to is anger. He makes anger sound almost medicinal when it's healthy. Like, no, get out of my space is a full sentence. But we have trained people to apologize for boundaries. Especially the polite people, which is kind of sinister. The nice ones are often the most exhausted ones. Because niceness can be a mask for repression. Exactly, and then the immune system pays the bill. That bridge between emotion and immunity is huge. He is basically saying the body is not being dramatic. The body is, annoyingly, being correct. That psychoimmunology point is what people miss. He is not saying thoughts magically cure cancer. He is saying repression changes the system itself. That's way less glamorous and way more real. And honestly, way more annoying to ignore. Because now you cannot just buy a wellness candle and move on. He also keeps returning to the idea of not being seen. That one hit harder than the science for me. Because the public version of him got wrecked by that backlash. And underneath that was an old child wound getting poked. That's the cruel thing about criticism. It never only lands in the present. It finds the oldest bruise in the room. Your ego thinks it's a review. Your nervous system thinks it's war. That's actually too accurate, which is rude. And then he does the unsexy thing and asks for help. Which honestly is the whole story right there. The strong people are always the last ones to surrender. Or to admit they are not actually built differently. That whole I can handle it myself thing is such a trap. Especially for men who were taught that help equals weakness. He basically says babies are born needing attunement. And if that gets interrupted, the adult keeps chasing it. That part feels almost embarrassing in how human it is. We really are just advanced toddlers with credit cards. Which is why the relationship part gets messy fast. Because partners become therapists, mothers, judges, everything. And then everyone is offended that it imploded. Incredible mystery, the marriage was not improved by psychic outsourcing. Psychic outsourcing is an insane phrase, but yes. He is blunt about how untreated anxiety gets projected, and how the other person gets punished for not mind reading. That is such a brutal mirror for anybody in a relationship. Because everybody thinks they are the misunderstood one. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they are impossible. Fair, that does have to be said. I loved when he talked about gut feeling too. Not as mysticism, but as actual bodily intelligence. The idea that the gut and heart are part of knowing is huge. Because overthinking is often just disembodied fear. And the brain is very committed to being wrong loudly. It really is, especially at 2 a.m. The scary part is how early people learn to ignore that signal. He keeps calling it trauma, but not always with spectacle. Sometimes it's just parents too stressed to see you. which is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And explanations are where healing starts, not blame. Though people always want healing without the inconvenient truth part. Yeah, like give me recovery, but make it brand safe. The cleanest thing he says is that success can hide pain. That one is dangerous because it flatters everybody. You can be rich, admired, productive, and still unraveling. That is the part people really do not want to hear. The laptop and the trophy are not emotional regulation. They are just expensive props, basically. And maybe that's why the self-awareness hits so hard here. Because he is not talking from a pedestal. He is openly saying, I still get pulled off center. That makes the whole thing more believable. And honestly, more useful. Because then it is not theory, it is practice. And practice means catching yourself before the spiral wins. Which is a pretty good life skill, if we're being honest. Not glamorous, just life-saving. That should probably be the headline. Way better than the usual headline, honestly. All right, we should land this plane before we turn it into a seminar. Too late, but at least it was a good seminar. The next episode gets into family scripts and identity, which is where it really gets dangerous. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And that is exactly where we pick it up next. Episode 2 is where the inherited stuff starts speaking louder. That is the part that hits hardest, because the body is not subtle. It just keeps score when the mind keeps making excuses. That line should honestly annoy every overachiever on Earth, especially the ones who think discipline can outsmart pain. And he is saying pain is not a weakness issue, it is a history issue. Which is wild, because people still hear trauma and think only of disasters. He keeps dragging it back to what was missing, not just what happened. That is the brutal part, because neglect can look invisible from the outside. No bruises, no headlines, just a kid quietly disappearing. And then that kid becomes an adult who cannot even name what is wrong. You know what I keep thinking about? The whole nice guy thing. Like, congratulations, you became easy to be around and impossible to feel. That is exactly the trap, though. He is basically saying niceness can be repression in a clean suit. And everybody claps for it until the body starts protesting. Anxiety, chronic stress, autoimmune stuff, addiction, depression, the whole pile. He is not calling them random. He is calling them adaptations. That changes the moral judgment around all of it, doesn't it? It stops being, why are you like this, and becomes, what happened to you? That question is way harder to dodge, because the answer usually ruins your favorite story about yourself. And then there is his own story, which is annoying in the best way. The fact that he is teaching all this and still gets swallowed by the same pattern. That is so human it almost hurts. He does not get saved by knowledge alone, which is the whole point. If intelligence cured stress, CEOs would be immortal, and every therapist would be out of business by Tuesday. But he literally describes the gap between public wisdom and private chaos, which is the most uncomfortable gap a person can have, because then your whole identity starts feeling performative. The internet break was such a revealing move, honestly. No phone, no email, no ego snacks from the outside world. Ego snacks is a disgusting phrase, but it works. He kept checking for something and realizing there was nothing there. That is almost embarrassing in a very deep way. Because you are supposed to be the guy with all the answers. And instead you are staring at a phone like it owes you meaning. That is a terrifying mirror for basically everyone. What I like is that he does not romanticize it. He says, I was stressed, I was fraught, I was losing myself. That honesty is way more useful than polished certainty. Because people actually trust the messier version. Especially when the mess is tied to success, not failure. That is the other huge idea here, right? Success can be a trap. Everybody wants the success lesson until it costs them their nervous system. Then suddenly the dream feels like unpaid labor. He says success made him more miserable because it fed the outside appetite. More attention, more tours, more validation, less self. That is such a nasty trade. And it is the trade so many high performers make without noticing. The Prince Harry thing made it worse because it was so public and so loaded. Not just the interview, but the paywall, the backlash, the distortion. Nothing says healing like a legal team and a media pile-on. That is grotesquely funny, actually. But what got me is how quickly he links criticism to old abandonment. Not being seen is not a vanity wound for him, it is childhood material. That makes the whole reaction make sense in a painful way. because the present is just touching an old bruise. And people keep acting like bruises are supposed to be rational. Emotional memory is extremely rude. The best line in there might be help is the bravest word. That is almost offensive to the male ego, which is probably why it matters. Men hear help and immediately start negotiating with reality. He is saying the opposite of stoicism is not weakness, it is truth. And truth is what lets the nervous system come down. That midfrontal cortex idea is fascinating because stress literally narrows access. It is like the smart part of you gets benched by your own alarm system. Your brain says, "Excellent, we will now be very stupid." Exactly, and then you call it personality. Meditation becomes less mystical and more like maintenance. Same with the gut feeling stuff, which he refuses to make fluffy. He keeps insisting intuition is embodied, not imaginary. And that is annoying to anyone who worships logic as a religion. Fair, but the body usually knows before the spreadsheet does. He is basically saying trauma can disconnect the signals between brain, gut, and heart, which means you stop trusting yourself from the inside out. That is such a bigger loss than people realize. Because then every relationship becomes a negotiation with fear. And that is where the marriage piece gets really sharp. He is ruthless about the way couples replay childhood. Ruthless but not unfair, which is the impressive part. The wife becomes the mother substitute. The man becomes the resentful child. That is such a humiliating sentence to hear out loud. But a lot of people would secretly recognize themselves instantly. And if you do not name it, you just call it chemistry problems. Or compatibility, which is the polite way to say disaster. I also liked how he framed women carrying more of the peacemaker role. It is uncomfortable because it sounds like a pattern people know but avoid naming. Then the body pays the bill when the mouth will not. That link between repression and autoimmune disease is the wildest part. Not wild as in magical, wild as in depressing and plausible. The least fun kind of wild. But he ties it to boundary defense, which makes it click. Anger is just the system saying this is too far. That is so different from the cartoon version of anger people carry. It is not rage as identity, it is protection in the moment. And if you keep swallowing that protection, something else has to speak. Often the immune system does it, which is the terrifying thesis here. That is why he keeps saying the emotional and immune systems are not separate. He is not making a metaphor, he is making a physiology argument. And that is much harder to dismiss. People love dismissing feelings until biology enters the room. Then suddenly everybody becomes very interested in nuance. What stays with me is how often he returns to the child needing to be seen. Not praised, not managed, not optimized, just seen. That is probably the simplest and hardest thing in the whole conversation. Because seen people do not need to become performance projects. Which is very bad news for whole industries built on insecurity. That part, yes, absolutely. And I think his own embarrassment is what makes it trustworthy. He is not above the wound, he is still inside the work. That is probably why the conversation lands so hard. It is not theory from a safe distance, it is someone catching himself live. Which is what most people need to see, honestly. You need to see that insight does not equal immunity. And that is the perfect place to leave it before we keep spiraling. Because we are absolutely capable of doing a 2-hour detour on one sentence. Next episode is where the family scripts and identity stuff gets even messier. That is where the inherited patterns stop whispering and start shouting. And that is exactly when it gets dangerous in the best way. We will pick it up there.